This episode is brought to you by Google Chrome. You think you know a browser, but Gemini and Chrome? That's new. It can help you with practically anything on the web, like restoring a vintage motorcycle from a 50-page restoration blog, or finally break down that long article you've had open for weeks. Gemini and Chrome is here for it. Ready to make anything online make sense? There's no place like Chrome. Check responses, setup required, compatibility and availability varies, 18+.
Study and play come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get the best of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network.
While many of the legitimate sovereigns of the Old World are afraid to show themselves in any part of their dominions unless attended by numerous and well-armed guards, the chief magistrate of this free republic travels fearlessly and comparatively alone, through the whole extent of the Union, everywhere receiving those lively evidences of cordiality, respect, and attachment, which his unassuming yet dignified deportment is so peculiarly calculated to excite. Boston Patriot, 4 July 1817.
The President's tour is producing beneficial effects. It is restoring harmony and social intercourse, of which we could not present a more memorable proof than the address from the city of Hartford. Party distinction is everywhere dropped, and the Chief Magistrate is not considered the president of the party. New York Columbian, 27 June 1817.
For ourselves, we believe that a spirit of conciliation is rapidly gaining ground. The arm of jealousy is already palsied. Those mists which have darkened the political horizon begin to be dissipated by a sober reformation in public opinion, and we look forward with a pleasing anticipation to the period when this ardour of expectation shall be more fully realised, when the wild delusions of the partisan shall vanish, and the friend of his country, whatever be his political views, shall cherish those sentiments which are the true basis of a republican government. Newburyport Herald, 25th of July, 1817.
After the Senate confirmed the new president's initial appointments and closed out their special session in early March 1817, one of the first decisions Monroe made was to take a page from the first person to hold his new office and go on a tour of the nation. As we shall see, though in the modern context, this seems like an easy decision, Monroe would soon learn how complex this prospect was to carry out in 1817 America. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to welcome you to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. In order to get this episode going, I'm joined by a few fellow podcasters who graciously offered to provide opening quotes. Giving voice to the words of the Newburyport Herald is David from Tudoriferous. He and his co-host Lucy are exploring the various historical figures of the Tudor era, and believe me, if you thought the story of Henry VIII was scandalous, you haven't seen anything yet. From popes to royal pretenders, from queens to diplomats, from de la Pole to de Vere, they explore the ins and outs of early modern England and beyond to get a richer picture of a pivotal time in history. Check them out by going to tudoriferous.wordpress.com or by searching for Tudoriferous wherever fine podcasts can be found. For the other two quotes, Cody and Steve from the Imperfect Men podcast lent their voices. Whereas my focus is presidents and their administrations, Cody and Steve are exploring the lives, careers, and legacies of not just the presidential founding fathers, but all the signers of the Continental Association, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the U.S. Constitution. From Andrew Adams to George Wythe, they have covered some of the big names like Benjamin Franklin and John Hancock, as well as some folks who you may not be as familiar with, like John Dickinson and Rufus King. I'll have a link on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com, or you can search for Imperfect Men wherever you get your podcasts.
You can't reason with the sun. Trust us, we've tried. This summer, it's time to put that angry ball of fire on mute. Columbia's OmniShade technology is engineered to protect you from the sun's harsh rays that can burn and damage your skin. The sun is relentless, but so is our gear. Level up your summer at Columbia.com to spend more time outside and less time slathering on aloe lotion. You're welcome. Columbia, engineered for whatever.
It seems that the idea of a national tour started in a different vein for Monroe. The earliest reference to it that I've been able to find in primary sources was in the memoirs of Joseph G. Swift, the head of the Army Corps of Engineers. Swift recounted accompanying President Monroe to a quarry, quote, on the Potomac on March 25, 1817, to look for materials to use in the reconstruction of the U.S. Capitol. During their journey that day, Monroe told him about his plan to make, quote, a tour of inspection of the fortifications and navy yards in the Union. Further, he wanted Swift to accompany him on this trip. Now, I ask you, dear listeners, to reflect upon what we've learned of Monroe over the years. Though Monroe had a lengthy diplomatic career, at his heart and at the core of his being was his service under Washington in the Revolutionary War. During the War of 1812, he pushed hard for a military commission or for being moved over to become Secretary of War. When folks rotated in and out of that position, Monroe would serve as acting secretary until finally getting his wish in 1814 when, in desperation after the burning of Washington, Monroe got the position full-time while also serving as Secretary of State. After the war, and given all that he had seen on a first-hand basis, Monroe continued to advocate for a strong national defense. Thus, it's not surprising that he would see a survey of the nation's defenses with his own eyes as a priority upon taking office as president. The problem, of course, was the logistics. As with any trip, Monroe had to think about how he'd pay for the trip. In the first of what will be a number of challenging concepts for listeners in the 21st century to wrap our minds around, Congress in 1817, quote, made no provision for the extraneous expenses of holding office as president, including, but not limited, to travel. Now, to this point, that hadn't been much of a problem. George Washington had been the only president who had engaged in a national tour. The others had only traveled to and from their home during their tenures of office. For Washington, though it was a great expense, Washington's finances were well enough that he could manage. As we've already seen, though, Monroe's finances were not nearly as solid as Washington's had been. Indeed, during the course of his tours of the nation, Monroe ultimately, quote, sold his furniture to the government for use in the newly refurbished President's House, drew on the income of his farms, and borrowed money from the bank in order to pay for his travel expenses. As we've discussed numerous times on the podcast, traveling at this time was not for the faint of heart. Roads could be rough even traveling in more densely populated parts of the nation, and a vast part of the nation was not densely populated. Monroe, however, was an experienced traveler. He had traveled extensively in North America as well as in Europe, and he had an expectation on this journey of traveling without much fanfare. Again, one of those points that for modern students of history makes us scratch our heads. The President of the U.S. traveling around the nation without people making a big to-do of it. However, as the editors of the first volume of the Papers of James Monroe point out, quote, Jefferson and Madison regularly traveled between the Capitol and their farms without people taking much notice of them. And in the relaxed atmosphere of Washington, the president moved about the city as freely as any other resident. Indeed, at this point, when mass media was still in its infancy, most people had no clue what the president even looked like. As we shall see, though, news traveled faster than Monroe anticipated, even in 1817. When Monroe shared his plans with his frequent correspondent Nicholas Biddle of Philadelphia, Biddle wrote back on April 10th in wholehearted support of the idea. As he told Monroe, since Washington's tours, quote, the president had unfortunately appeared to the nation too much like the chief clerk of Congress, a cabinet man, stationary at his desk, relying exclusively on secretaries, and invisible except to those who seek him. Biddle thought it would be a great idea for, quote, the community to see the chief magistrate examining for himself and taking care that the operations confined to him are not marred by the negligence or infidelity of agents. Now, we should note, Biddle still thought of this trip as Monroe had originally conceived it, a lack of fanfare inspection tour of the nation's defenses. Indeed, in his initial planning for it, Monroe planned for only a small party to accompany him, a 19-year-old private secretary named John Mason Jr., and an unspecified number of servants. Now, to address the latter first, even the editors of the papers of James Monroe could not determine the number of servants that accompanied him, or also whether the servants, quote, were whites, free blacks, or slaves. Sadly, we will likely never know who was with him on this trip, but just know that, though it was a small party initially, Monroe was never traveling completely incognito. In addition to helping him to gather information about conditions on the ground in other parts of the nation, the trip to New England would also give the folks working to reconstruct the executive mansion time to complete their work. Though there was still work to be done after Monroe's inauguration, in just over 2 years' time, as described by historian William Seal, quote, the president's house had sprung up phoenix-like from a ruin of cracked walls and ashes. Monroe would take a much more active role in the building's reconstruction than his predecessor, and insisted on weekly reports, as well as set a deadline of October for his moving in. As he planned his swing up the coast to Maine, then through New Hampshire, Vermont, and northern and western New York to Michigan and Ohio, before swinging back through Pittsburgh to return to the nation's capital, Monroe figured that was enough time to have the house ready for him and his family to occupy. Starting in mid-April, brief notices about his travel plans started appearing in newspapers, including the Boston Columbian Sentinel, the Baltimore Patriot, and the Richmond Enquirer. Later in the month, longer accounts appeared in the Washington National Intelligencer, the Boston Columbian Sentinel, and the Boston Patriot, while the Baltimore Federal Republican and the Salem Gazette posted brief notes. For some reason, the newspapers in Boston got the idea that Elizabeth Monroe, or, as she was referred to in the Salem Gazette, the Presidentress, would be traveling with her husband. Given her health concerns, as we talked about in the First Lady's special episode, however, it is not surprising that, from the beginning of his planning, Monroe intended for his family to go back to Virginia while he was on his tour. Meanwhile, starting on May 1st, Secretary of the Navy Benjamin Crowninshield began to send out notices to naval officers at various Navy yards and posts in the Northeast about Monroe's impending visit and intentions to visit their facilities. At some point, it was decided that Attorney General Richard Rush, then acting as Secretary of State, would also accompany Monroe. As plans were being made, it became clear that Monroe didn't intend for this to be his only tour. He wrote to Andrew Jackson on May 21st that, quote, next year, I propose to make a similar tour, should Congress adjourn in time, to the westward and southward. Finally, despite a brief illness that delayed his plans, at the end of the month, on May 31st, after seeing his family off on a carriage bound for his Highland estate in Charlottesville, Monroe and his small party departed from Washington, D.C. in a carriage bound for Baltimore. It quickly became clear that this would not be an under-the-radar trip as a private citizen, as the party was met and escorted into Baltimore, quote, by a troop of 1st Baltimore Hussars and a large concourse of citizens on horseback. The next 2 days were filled with citizen delegations delivering addresses to him, parades, militia reviews, tours of monuments in the area, and public dinners. Though Monroe did actually get around to inspecting the defensive fortifications in Baltimore, including a tour of Fort McHenry, the president had to concede that this was going to be a very public tour rather than just the business trip he had conceived. However, we should note that by the time he set off, Monroe at least had an inkling that this was bound to happen. As noted by his biographer Tim McGrath, Monroe had in his luggage when he set off, quote, a deep blue jacket, buff vest, buff breeches, and a broad-brimmed, large flat hat worn by naval officers that they could compress and put under their arms without damaging. If this sounds rather akin to the uniform that an officer in the Continental Army would have worn, don't think that the resemblance went unnoticed or unplanned by Monroe. The new president was no fool. Rather than being upset by the shift in his plans, Monroe embraced the opportunity to try to bring the nation together. He leaned into visits with revolutionary patriots like signer of the Declaration, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, and a dinner hosted by the Society of the Cincinnati in his honor in Philadelphia. He delivered remarks at Trenton, New Jersey upon his arrival on June 7th, remembering it as, quote, the place where the hopes of the country were revived in the War of the Revolution by a signal victory obtained by the troops under the command of General Washington. With the uniform that he had taken out of his luggage and put on for the occasion, reminding everyone that he had been in that body of troops under Washington's command and had suffered a near-fatal wound there. Though Monroe would not remark upon his injury, the local press made sure to mention it as, quote, the people flocked not merely to behold the chief executive, but to view one of the last of the patriots of 1776 who would hold high office. Next up on his tour was New York City, where Monroe was treated to, quote, 3 full days of parades, tours, and banquets in his honor. As Monroe's vice president, Daniel D. Tompkins, lived on Staten Island, the president used the opportunity to visit with this man who, though they had been running mates in the election the year prior, the Virginian did not know all that well beyond their wartime correspondence, while Monroe was serving as Secretary of War and Tompkins had been governor of New York. Indeed, the two were from different backgrounds. Monroe, who had just turned 59, had been on the national stage for decades, while Tompkins, who was just about to turn 43, had been catapulted first into the governorship, then, due to his service in the defense of New York, into the vice presidency. While I'll refer you to his vice presidency's episodes to do a deeper dive into Tompkins, just know that Monroe's time staying with the Tompkins family at their estate on Staten Island afforded him an opportunity not only to get better acquainted with the younger New Yorker, but also to draw on his knowledge of the defensive fortifications of New York Harbor. It should be noted that President Monroe also used his time in New York as an opportunity to reach out to the nation's most prominent Federalist, Senator Rufus King. While King appreciated the effort on Monroe's part, he did note that the president was still suffering from a fever, the illness that had initially delayed his departure from Washington. Still, he pressed on. Monroe's trip to what was by this point the largest city of the nation was broken up with a side trip to West Point. The president stayed there for 3 days, not to review conditions there or even to rest and recover his health. Rather, Monroe had, quote, to mediate a dispute between Captain Alden Partridge and his faculty. The president ultimately decided to remove Partridge as superintendent and replaced him with Sylvanus Thayer. Superintendent Thayer would go on to command West Point for the next 16 years. In another nod to how this trip pointed towards a shift to a new future was one of the means that Monroe was using to get around, the steamboat. Work to bring steam power to use in water transportation had begun at the end of the 18th century, but Robert Fulton's successful demonstration in 1807 of how a steamboat could improve transportation on the Hudson River led to an explosion of the use of the technology in multiple places in the U.S. within the next few years. Indeed, at this point in his trip, Monroe had already traveled from Baltimore to Philadelphia aboard a steamboat, and his detour to West Point was quickly and easily accomplished by a steamship, whereas the voyage would have been much more slow-going just a few years earlier. From New York, Monroe and his party went on to the heart of New England, beginning his journey to this region aboard a, you guessed it, steamboat to New Haven, Connecticut. While there were some detractors, like the editor of the Hampton Federalist, which denounced Monroe for having arrived in Baltimore on a Sunday and being greeted by the crowd in, quote, his flagrant breach of the Sabbath and violation of the law of God. Even in conservative New England, the heartland of federalism, Monroe was received by and large with enthusiasm. As described by Ammon, quote, few presidential visits before or since have aroused such an outpouring of emotion. Everywhere, the leaders of both parties joined to welcome the president. As noted by Cunningham, quote, Monroe had no set speech that he delivered at every sojourn, nor did he have a speechwriter. At shorter stops, he made brief remarks extemporaneously. Longer speeches he composed himself. His style was ponderous, lacking the brilliant conciseness of Jefferson or the profundity of Madison. It should be noted that a president delivering speeches like this was still a novelty rather than a standard. Indeed, neither Jefferson nor Madison had done this during their tenures, though the editors of the papers of James Monroe note that Madison may once have delivered remarks to neighbors in Virginia. Instead of just being platitudes of gratification, Monroe would use many of these speaking engagements to talk about policy matters, including, quote, the necessity of an adequate national defense, the strength of the Union of the States, the value of the nation's republican institutions, the greatness of the American Revolution, the importance of public education, and even an affirmation of the nation's commitment to freedom of religion. Monroe's arrival in Boston, then as now the center of culture and politics in New England, was particularly poignant, for the president would be there for the 4th of July celebrations. His remarks in this region in particular would center on the theme of national unity, a call to put aside partisan divides that had resulted in threats of secession from leaders in New England just a few short years ago during the War of 1812. Amidst the 40,000 people waiting for him upon his arrival in Boston was one of his predecessors, former President John Adams. However, Monroe in Boston would not just be greeted by famous dignitaries. At one point, quote, 4,000 children stood on the common in 2 ranks through which the president walked, with each of them, boys and girls alike, quote, wearing red or white roses as a sign of unity. Young and old alike came out to see Monroe, and as one Federalist noted of this part of his trip, quote, the president is here. He rides hard, visits everything. Prior to continuing on his journey, Monroe made a quick detour to spend some more time with one of only 3 other people alive at that point who understood the duty and responsibility he had taken up earlier that year. On July 4th, Monroe wrote to John Adams of his, quote, regret that I could not have the pleasure of seeing you again before you left town. Monroe had apparently called at Adams's lodgings the day prior, only to discover his departure. He was determined, however, not to let the opportunity to talk more with the elder statesman go to waste. Thus, on July 7th, Monroe made his way to Adams's home, Peacefield, in Quincy. He was not alone, however. As noted by McGrath, the president was, quote, riding in a cortege of carriages carrying 40 eminent men of both parties. Adams greeted Monroe by saying, quote, "Sir, I'm happy to welcome you and your friends, and to acknowledge my high appreciation of the distinction which you propose to confer on my son as Secretary of State." Monroe was apparently so overcome with the feeling of goodwill that he simply responded, quote, "I have but performed an act of justice to high ability and merit." A few days later, Abigail Adams wrote to Richard Rush, still acting Secretary of State, asserting that Monroe's, quote, "tour through the northeastern states has been highly gratifying to the people and conciliatory to parties who have mingled without distinction. The agreeable affability and unassuming manners of the president, with his polite attentions to all orders and ranks, has made a deep and lasting impression here. I hope the president will return to the seat of government, not worn out and exhausted as we have feared, but pleased and gratified with the manifestation of the goodwill of the people toward him, and with an enlarged knowledge of the nation over which he is to preside." It would still be some time, however, before Monroe returned to the nation's capital. His journey through Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont would present a poignant moment in Hanover, New Hampshire, where, at a large reception where he was greeting folks in a receiving line, the president recognized Maria Wheelock, maiden name Soom, the woman who had, quote, "dressed his wound on the Trenton battlefield 40 years before." Though their words to one another were not recorded, no doubt it was a touching reunion for both. In late July, Monroe and his party proceeded through northern New York to the naval base at Sackett's Harbor, where he took a naval vessel in early August to Fort Niagara in western New York. Again, in a sign of just how much had changed, the British garrison commander at Fort George in Canada invited the American president to cross the border for an official visit. Had he accepted, this would have been the first instance of a sitting U.S. president leaving the country. However, though he expressed his gratitude at the invitation, Monroe declined the honor, using the excuse of needing to keep on his planned schedule. Turning back to what Monroe found on the ground at this point in his tour, western New York had suffered during the War of 1812, with Buffalo having been sacked and burned down at the end of December 1813. However, as we discussed in episode 5.3, the region was poised for growth with the construction of the planned canal across the state, for which the groundbreaking had been officiated by Governor DeWitt Clinton just a month prior. Once completed, just as Monroe did, ships would be able to set out across Lake Erie to carry on commerce with other points in the West, including Detroit, which was the president's next destination when he set sail aboard a naval schooner on August 9th. Monroe had written to his son-in-law, George Hay, from Sackett's Harbor a few days prior that, quote, "My health is, I think, better, in consequence of less fatigue of late." Naturally, traveling in less populated parts of the nation meant fewer events to attend than at the beginning of his journey. Monroe continued that, quote, "The whole country here is healthy, and I think I shall derive advantages from being on the lake in a good brig, where I shall be quiet and have good air." When he disembarked in Detroit on August 13th, Monroe became the first sitting president to visit the Midwest. As stated by Cunningham, his inclusion of this region in his itinerary, quote, reflected Monroe's long-standing interest in the West, as well as a growing national recognition of that section's vital role in the Union. McGrath notes that, quote, "the rusticity he found in Michigan and Ohio recalled his childhood in the northeast woodlands of Virginia, the farms and cabins, the parents plowing their land or plying a trade, reminding him of his own childhood." Monroe spent the last 2 weeks of August traveling through Ohio, then in early September went through western Pennsylvania before returning to Washington through Maryland on September 17th. As we heard in our opening quotes, many in the various parts of the nation that he visited hailed his tour as signaling an end to partisanship and the beginning of a new national era. One might even say an era of good feelings. However, not everyone was impressed. Articles appeared in the Richmond Enquirer which indicated that Democratic Republicans in Virginia were not as willing to adopt a water-under-the-bridge approach to New England Federalists following their opposition to the war effort in the recent war with Britain. In an essay printed on September 5th, the Enquirer asserted that, quote, "The sentiments of base adulation which have marked the tone, the tenor of the gratulatory addresses of the people through whose towns he has passed serve completely to develop the character of Eastern Federalism. During the continuance of the Second War of Independence, where were these flaming patriots? Where were these friends to the Union of the States? I'm convinced that the President will not be lulled into listlessness by these specious pretenses. I trust he attaches to these professions that importance which they justly merit. If any good results from them, let him have it. The people of the South have more real regard for the President than these pretended friends." Secretary of the Treasury William Crawford and Speaker of the House Henry Clay also had words about the, quote, "pomp and ostentatious parade that were put on in, quote, the land of shady habits," as Crawford dubbed New England. Indeed, Monroe had not forgotten his previous animosity for the Federalists, and while he sought them out during his trip to bring about a reconciliation, he told his son-in-law George Hay that Federalists would have to prove themselves and that he would insist on, quote, "a union of parties on Republican principles." Even this, however, posed risk for Monroe. As noted by Ammon, quote, "The party reconciliation, which Monroe so ardently envisaged as an essential development to ensure the stability of Republican institutions, complicated the problem of executive leadership, since the President could no longer appeal to party solidarity as a means of putting his program through Congress." From the moment that Monroe adopted as his guiding principle the maxim that he was the head of a nation, not the leader of a party, he repudiated, for all practical purposes, party unity as a means of realizing presidential policies. Still, as Monroe pulled up to the President's house in Washington with the Marine Corps band playing to welcome him home, he had to feel a certain degree of pride in what he had achieved. As noted by McGrath, quote, "Over 110 days, Monroe had visited more than 120 cities, towns, and settlements, many of which would not see another president for decades. He traveled nearly 3,000 miles across lakes and rivers on cobblestone streets and rutted or muddy roads. In addition to seeing firsthand the state of his country's defenses, Monroe also saw for himself the actual state of the Union, something beyond the superficial pomp and ceremony extended him. We shall see as we go along how Monroe would take the knowledge gained on his journey and apply it to crafting policy. But for now, our time together is drawing to a close. With our next Monroe episode, we'll look beyond the domestic concerns of the Monroe administration and get a sense on what's happening abroad, both in other parts of the Western Hemisphere as well as across the Atlantic. Until then, thank you so much again to David, Cody, and Stephen for lending their voices for our opening quotes. And be sure to check out Tutoriferous and Imperfect Men wherever you get your podcasts. I'll have a link to both on the page for this episode on my website at presidenciespodcast.com. There, you can also find sources used for this episode, past episodes of the podcast, links to more about all the American presidents, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the Presidency's podcast. Special thanks also to Christian of Your Podcast Pal for his audio editing work on this episode. If you'd like to enlist Christian services for your podcast, check out his website at yourpodcastpal.com. Thank you so much to all of our patrons for their generous support, which helps me to have the equipment and resources that I need to be able to produce the podcast. If you're interested in signing up for as little as $1 per month, just go to patreon.com/presidencies. Patrons get a token of appreciation from me at each of the tiers, and all patrons get access to an ad-free feed, which also contains some special episodes, such as the recent John C. Calhoun Outtakes episode. If you're not able to commit to a monthly donation, there are other ways you can support the podcast. I have a research wish list available at tinyurl.com/presidentiespodcast with books identified that will help to prepare for upcoming episodes. You can also leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podchaser, or anywhere else with that capability. I cannot thank all of you who have fulfilled book requests, as well as shared with folks why they too should be listening to the Presidencies podcast. I recently got a couple of new reviews, including a 5-star review from Wesley titled, "It's Great," and that reads as follows, quote, "I really like how Jerry presents everything." Thank you so much, Wesley. I greatly appreciate it. I also got another review from Mem History Buff titled, "Loyal Listener for Years," that reads as follows, quote, "I love how he covers the presidents in such depth. Wish he wouldn't spend so much time on Seat at the Table, as I care more about the presidential history, and I'll be about 200 years old at this pace." I appreciate your concerns about the pacing. I know I'm looking into cybernetic enhancements myself to keep myself going. But one of the reasons that I was doing so much with Seat at the Table was that I needed time to research for the Monroe presidency series after finishing up with Madison. But I didn't want the podcast to go dormant. Besides, learning about the Monroe cabinet members has really helped to reshape my understanding of Monroe's presidency, and I think will be reflected in how this series goes. Now that we are up and running with Monroe, I'm planning on Seat at the Table going on hiatus for a bit, as I don't want to get too far ahead with it from the main narrative series. I hope you'll enjoy what I've got ahead with Monroe, and thanks so much for being a long-time listener. Whether you've been listening from the beginning or are new to Presidencies, please feel free to reach out to me with any questions or comments via email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also connect with me on social media if you haven't already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, only formerly known as Twitter as Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Last but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
Uncovered windows can make your home feel up to 20 degrees hotter. Stay cool and save up to 45% off custom window treatments during the 4th of July VIP access sale at Blinds.com. From outdoor shades to room darkening blinds, finding the perfect fit is easy. Get free samples, expert design help, and professional measure and install services. Or DIY it with confidence and support every step of the way. Shop up to 45% off site-wide right now during the 4th of July VIP access sale at Blinds.com.
This episode is brought to you by Google Health. Stop chasing someone else's definition of health. What matters is what's healthy for you. Google Health offers a new kind of coach built with Gemini for effortless tracking, sleep insights, and holistic coaching tailored to you. Visit googlestore.com to learn more and start a new relationship with your health. Requires Google account, Google Health app, internet, and Google Health premium subscription. Features subject to change. Availability and results vary. Not intended for medical purposes. Works independently of Gemini apps. Check responses for accuracy.